The air in the jungle was a physical presence. It was thick, wet, and heavy with the smell of decay, a sweet, cloying odor of rot that clung to the back of the throat. For weeks, it had been the only air they breathed, a constant reminder of where they were, a forgotten corner of Burma, a place that felt as if it had been chewed up and spat out by the war. The year was 1944. The monsoon had broken, and the world had dissolved into a palette of greens and greys, a landscape of perpetual twilight beneath a triple canopy of teak and bamboo that swallowed the sun. Rain fell not in drops, but in sheets, turning the already sodden ground into a slick, red-brown river of mud that pulled at their boots with every step. They were ghosts in this green hell, these young men from Ohio and Texas and California, their faces etched with a weariness that went far beyond the physical exhaustion of the campaign. They had seen things that would forever haunt the quiet moments of their lives, should they be lucky enough to have any. They moved in silence, a long, staggered column of muted olive drab, their movements economical, their senses honed to a razor's edge. The only sounds were the squelch of their boots in the mud, the rhythmic clink of their gear, and the incessant, maddening drone of insects. They were hunting men, but in this place, it felt as though the land itself was the enemy, an alien world of strangling vines and unseen things that slithered and stung. Every shadow held a potential threat. Every rustle of leaves could be the last sound you ever heard. This was the war in the Pacific, a brutal, grinding conflict fought not over grand cities or sweeping plains, but over anonymous patches of jungle, volcanic rock, and coral sand. It was a war of inches and attrition, of malaria and dysentery as much as of bullets and bayonets. It was a war that stripped away everything but the primal instinct to survive. Ahead, the point man raised a hand, his form nearly invisible against the dense foliage. The column halted, melting into the landscape, 100 heartbeats suddenly still. There was a clearing ahead, an unnatural break in the suffocating green. Through the curtain of rain, they could make out a cluster of low, thatched-roofed huts, crudely constructed and arranged in a rough quadrangle. A thin plume of smoke, quickly beaten down by the rain, rose from one of the structures. It was a Japanese supply depot, or perhaps a small garrison. The orders were simple: neutralize any resistance, secure any intelligence, and move on. It was a task they had performed a dozen times before. It was the grim, bloody arithmetic of war. They advanced in a flanking maneuver, their movements fluid, practiced, and deadly. They were a machine built for this single purpose. The tension was a palpable thing, a coiling snake in the pit of the stomach. But the expected crack of a Nambu rifle never came. There were no shouts, no explosions, only the steady drumming of the rain on the palm-thatched roofs. The place was quiet. Too quiet. As they breached the perimeter, moving from hut to hut, they found it almost deserted. There were signs of a hasty withdrawal, overturned crates of ammunition, scattered papers, a half-eaten bowl of rice crawling with ants. The enemy had fled, melted back into the jungle from which they had come. It was an anticlimax, a release of tension that left them feeling hollow and exposed. It was in the last hut, the largest of the structures, that they found them. The interior was dark and suffocating, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap perfume, and fear. As their eyes adjusted to the gloom, they saw shapes huddled in the corners, silent and still. They were women, dozens of them, packed into the small space, their faces pale and drawn in the dim light. They were mostly young, some barely out of their teens, their traditional Korean dresses, their hanboks, worn and stained. They did not look up. They simply sat there, their heads bowed, their hands clenched in their laps, waiting. They had been waiting for a long time. For the soldiers, for the boots on the wooden floor, for the rough hands and the slurred words. It was the only life they knew. It was the rhythm of their days and the terror of their nights. A young private, a boy from Iowa who still had the faint dusting of freckles across his nose, took a hesitant step forward. He held a chocolate bar in his hand, a small, selfish treasure he had been saving for days. He knelt down and offered it to the nearest woman, He meant it as a gesture of kindness, of reassurance. But the woman flinched violently, pulling away as if he had offered her a snake. A wave of terror washed over her face, her eyes wide with a primal fear that he had only ever seen in the eyes of a cornered animal. She began to tremble, a low, guttural sound of pure dread escaping her lips. In that moment, the young private understood. He was not a liberator. He was not a savior. He was just another man in a uniform, another pair of heavy boots on the floor. And in her world, that meant only one thing. The silence in the hut was broken by the sound of weeping, a soft, hopeless sound that was more terrible than any scream. The American soldiers stood there, rooted to the spot, the rain still beating down outside, the jungle pressing in on all sides. The war had just presented them with a new and terrible kind of horror, one for which there had been no training, no briefing, no preparation. They had stumbled into one of the darkest secrets of the Japanese Empire, a place that wasn't on any map, a crime that had no name. They had found a comfort station. The machinery of war is built on euphemism. Men are not killed, they are lost. A retreat is a tactical withdrawal, and the systematic, industrial-scale sexual enslavement of hundreds of thousands of women and girls is given a name that is so grotesquely benign, it borders on the surreal. Comfort women. This was the system the soldiers had been built by the Imperial Japanese Army. It was not some local, impromptu arrangement. It was policy. It was a continent-spanning network of institutionalized rape, meticulously organized and ruthlessly administered, stretching from the frozen plains of Manchuria to the sweltering archipelagos of the South Pacific. And the women in this hut were its prisoners, its raw material, its living, breathing, and endlessly suffering components. To understand how a nation could create such a system, one must first understand the ideology that fueled it. The Japan of the 1932 and 40 seconds was a society in the grip of a fervent, militaristic nationalism. It saw itself as a divine nation, the rightful leader of Asia, destined to expel the Western colonial powers and establish a new order, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This ideology was built upon a rigid social hierarchy, with the emperor, a living god, at its apex. Below him was the Japanese race, the Yamato Minzoku, seen as racially and spiritually superior to all others. Conquered peoples, particularly Koreans and the inhabitants of Southeast Asia, were viewed as lesser beings, their lands and resources existing only for the benefit of the empire, their bodies subject to the whims of their masters. It was within this crucible of racial supremacy and military expansion that the comfort women's system was forged. The official justifications provided by the military command were coldly pragmatic. Following the horrific, widespread atrocities committed by Japanese troops after the capture of major cities on the Asian mainland, the military leadership grew concerned, not with the morality of their soldiers' actions, but with the practical consequences. Such acts of violence bred hatred and resistance among the occupied populations, making them harder to control. They also led to a catastrophic spread of venereal diseases, which could cripple a fighting force more effectively than enemy bullets. And finally, there was the fear that international condemnation could damage Japan's standing on the world stage. The solution, in their chillingly logical calculus, was to provide a controlled, segregated, and readily available outlet for the sexual urges of their soldiers. They would create a system that would, in their view, maintain military discipline, preserve the health of the troops, and prevent random acts of violence by channeling them into a state-sanctioned institution. The recruitment of women to fill these stations was a study in deception and coercion. In Korea, which had been under Japanese colonial rule since 1910, young women were particularly vulnerable. The colonial administration had systematically dismantled Korean institutions and impoverished its people. Recruiters, often Koreans collaborating with the Japanese authorities, would sweep through destitute villages with enticing offers. They spoke of well-paying jobs in factories, of positions as nurses or waitresses in Japan or Manchuria. To families struggling with starvation, the promise of a steady income and one less mouth to feed was an irresistible lure. They promised a better life, a chance to support their families and serve the empire. For many young women, who had been raised in a deeply patriarchal society and taught to be obedient, the decision was not even theirs to make. A father, a brother, an uncle would accept the recruiter's advance payment, and the daughter's fate would be sealed. She would pack a small bundle of clothes, say goodbye to her mother, and step onto a train, believing she was heading towards a future of opportunity. The reality was a descent into a living nightmare. The journey itself was often the first sign that something was terribly wrong. They were packed onto military transports, crowded into the holds of ships with hundreds of other girls, their destinations shrouded in secrecy. When they arrived, it was not at a gleaming new factory or a bustling restaurant. It was at a place like this one, in the middle of the Burmese jungle, a collection of squalid huts surrounded by a fence, guarded by soldiers. It was here they were given their new names, Japanese names like Keiko or Yoshiko, their own identities stripped from them in the first of countless violations. They were told their purpose. They were not workers, they were Yanfu, comfort women, there to provide comfort to the soldiers of the Imperial Army. Any debt incurred by their families for their travel and upkeep would be repaid through their service. It was a debt that, for most, would never be settled. The daily reality of a comfort station was a relentless cycle of trauma and dehumanization. The women were assigned to small, cell-like rooms, often nothing more than a wooden platform with a thin mat. A schedule was posted. Each day, a long line of soldiers would form outside their doors. The numbers were staggering. Some survivors would later recall being forced to serve as 20, 30, even 40 men in a single day. On weekends, or after a major battle, the numbers would swell. There was no escape. The stations were often located near the front lines, in remote and heavily guarded areas. Resistance was met with brutal violence, beatings, starvation, torture. The women were subjected to regular medical examinations by army doctors, not for their well-being, but to ensure they remained clean for the soldiers' use. These inspections were just another form of violation, a cold, clinical procedure that reinforced their status as objects, as military equipment to be maintained. The soldiers who stood in that Burmese hut in 1944 could not have known all of this. They could not have grasped the sheer scale of the system, the intricate web of bureaucracy and ideology that lay behind it. All they saw were the faces in the gloom, faces that were masks of terror and resignation. They saw women who had been so thoroughly broken, so conditioned by years of relentless brutality, that the very presence of a man in uniform triggered an instantaneous, Pavlovian response of fear. The world of these women had been reduced to a single terrible equation: soldier equals pain. There was no other variable. They had been taught, through the most savage form of instruction, that their bodies were not their own, that their will was irrelevant, that their only purpose was to be used. They had forgotten what it was to be looked at with anything other than lust or contempt. They had forgotten the concept of a gentle touch, of a kind word from a man. Such things belonged to another life, a dream of a world that had long since ceased to exist. This was the chasm of experience that separated the liberators from the liberated. The American soldiers, for all the horrors they had witnessed in combat, came from a different universe of assumptions. They operated under a different set of rules, both written and unwritten. Their cultural framework, their understanding of the relationship between men and women, while by no means perfect, was fundamentally different from the one that had been imposed upon these captives. They saw the women not as military supplies, but as victims, as prisoners of war who needed help. And so, they did what their training and their instincts told them to do. They offered food. They offered water. They offered cigarettes and medical aid. They offered these small tokens of a shared humanity. And in doing so, they created a profound and terrifying cognitive dissonance in the minds of the women they were trying to help. Imagine, for a moment, the world from inside that hut. The rain is a constant, monotonous drumming on the roof, a sound you have come to associate with misery, with the damp chill that seeps into your bones. For years, the sound of heavy boots approaching your door has been the prelude to violence. The sight of a foreign uniform has meant only one thing. Your body has become a fortress under permanent siege, and your mind has retreated to a small, dark place deep inside, a place where you can try to feel nothing. Now, the boots are different. The language is different, but the uniforms are still there. A soldier approaches. He is tall, much taller than the men you are used to. He kneels. He holds out his hand. You brace yourself for the inevitable blow, the rough grab, but it doesn't come. In his hand is a strange, dark bar wrapped in paper. He makes a gentle, pushing motion with it. He is offering it to you. He is smiling, a strange, hesitant expression. What is this? A trick? A new form of cruelty you have not yet experienced? Your mind races, searching for a familiar pattern, for a way to interpret this impossible event. Every nerve ending screams at you to recoil, to make yourself smaller, to do whatever is necessary to minimize the coming pain. The soldier's gesture of kindness is so alien, so completely outside the brutal logic of your world, that it cannot be processed. It is like showing a color to a person who has lived their entire life in a black and white room. The sensory input is there, but the neural pathways to understand it do not exist. And so, the reaction is not gratitude, it is fear. A deeper, more disorienting fear than before. The old terror was, at least, predictable. This new emotion is a terrifying mystery. This scene, or variations of it, played out in comfort stations across the Pacific as the war drew to a close. In Burma, in the Philippines, on remote islands that were little more than blood-soaked specks of coral in an endless blue ocean. Allied soldiers, whether they were American, British, or Australian, would stumble upon these hidden compounds and be confronted with the same shocking reality. They found women who were starving, sick, and deeply traumatized, and almost universally they reacted with a mixture of pity, confusion, and a clumsy, well-intentioned desire to help. The official records of these encounters are often sparse and written in the dry, unemotional language of military reports. A.U.S. Army report from Burma in 1944 describes the capture of 20 Korean comfort girls and 2 Japanese housemasters. It notes their physical condition, their place of origin, and the details of their internment. But these reports cannot capture the human drama of the moment of contact. They cannot convey the texture of the silence in that hut, the smell of the rain and the fear, the look in the eyes of the young soldier from Iowa as he held out his chocolate bar and unwittingly shattered a universe. For the soldiers, these encounters were profoundly unsettling. They were trained to fight a male enemy, a soldier like themselves, who wore a uniform and carried a weapon. They understood the logic of combat, the kill or be killed imperative of the battlefield. But this was something else entirely. This was not war as they knew it. This was an organized system of degradation, a crime so vast and so intimate that it defied easy categorization. It forced them to confront a dimension of the enemy's ideology that was, in many ways, more disturbing than their banzai charges or their kamikaze attacks. Those were acts of war. This was an act of calculated, soul-destroying cruelty. It revealed a worldview in which other human beings, particularly women of conquered nations, were not just enemies, but were less than human, mere instruments to be used and discarded. The cultural gulf was immense. The American G.I. of the 1940 seconds was, by and large, a product of a society that, for all its own hypocrisies and injustices, still held to a certain ideal of chivalry. The idea of protecting women was deeply ingrained in their cultural DNA. They had been raised on Hollywood movies and Saturday Evening Post covers that depicted women as something to be cherished, defended, and placed on a pedestal. To find women who had been treated as little more than human plumbing was a profound shock to their system. Their initial response, therefore, was one of protection. They saw fragile, broken victims who needed to be saved. But the women themselves did not see it that way, at least not at first. They were not damsels in distress waiting for a hero. They were survivors. They had endured years of unimaginable horror by developing a complex set of psychological armor. They had learned to be compliant, to be invisible, to anticipate the desires and the rages of their captors. Now, faced with a new set of captors, for, in their minds, the Americans were simply that, a new set of men in charge, they fell back on the only survival mechanisms they knew. They expected abuse. They waited for the demands to begin. And when they did not, when they were met instead with offerings of food and cigarettes, with a strange and unfamiliar gentleness, the foundations of their grim reality began to crack. There is a powerful symbolism in the objects that were exchanged in those first, tentative encounters. A chocolate bar, a can of sea rations, a stick of chewing gum. These were the mundane, everyday items of the American war machine, the small comforts that connected a soldier to the world he had left behind. For a Hershey's bar was a taste of home, a fleeting moment of sweetness in a world of mud and fear. But when he offered that same chocolate bar to a Korean comfort woman, it became something else entirely. It became a symbol of a world she could no longer imagine. A world where a man might give a woman something without demanding anything in return. It was an artifact from another reality, a message that was too powerful to be immediately understood. The act of giving, with no strings attached, was a revolutionary concept in the world of the comfort station. In that world, everything had a price, and that price was always paid with the body. Food was not a gift, it was a tool of control, given or withheld to ensure obedience. A moment of rest was not a right, it was a temporary reprieve between violations. Every interaction with a man in uniform was a transaction, and the currency was always the same. The American soldiers, by their simple, unthinking acts of charity, were subverting the entire economic and psychological system of the comfort station. They were, in essence, speaking a language the women had been brutally conditioned to forget, the language of human decency. The process of deprogramming was slow and fraught with misunderstanding. In the camps where the rescued women were taken, the cultural collision continued. American medics would try to examine them, to treat the litany of diseases and injuries that were the legacy of their captivity. But the women would resist, terrified that this was yet another prelude to assault. A simple medical checkup, a touch on the arm to take a pulse, could trigger a violent panic attack. The language barrier was a formidable obstacle. Communication was often reduced to gestures, to smiles and frowns. The Americans, with their loud voices and their casual, easygoing physicality, could be unintentionally terrifying. The women, with their downcast eyes and their profound, bone-deep silence, were a mystery. It often fell to Nisei interpreters, Japanese-American soldiers, to bridge this gap. These men occupied a strange and difficult position in the war. They were fighting for America, yet their faces looked like the enemy's. When they were brought in to speak to the Korean women, they were often met with initial suspicion and hostility. They were, after all, speaking the language of the oppressor. But it was through them that the first, fragile threads of communication were spun. Through them, the women began to tell their stories, in fragmented, hesitant whispers. They spoke of their villages, of the recruiters' lies, of the long journey, of the endless lines of men. They gave voice to the unspeakable, and as they spoke, and as they were listened to, a slow, seismic shift began to occur. For the first time in years, they were being treated not as objects, but as witnesses. Their stories were being recorded. Their experiences were being validated. This, in itself, was a form of liberation. The Japanese military system had been designed to erase them, to render them anonymous and interchangeable. By telling their stories to the Americans, they were beginning the long, arduous process of reclaiming their identities, of insisting that they were not Keiko or Yoshiko, but Kim Hak-sun, or Lee Ok-seon, or Kang Il-chul. They were human beings with names, with families, with histories that had been stolen from them. For the American soldiers who were involved in this process, the experience was transformative. They had entered the war with a clear, almost cartoonish image of the Japanese enemy, a buck-toothed, bespectacled fanatic who screamed "Banzai" and fought to the last man. The comfort women system revealed a different, more insidious face of the enemy, It was the face of a cold, calculating bureaucracy, of an ideology that could justify the methodical destruction of human beings for the sake of military efficiency. It complicated their understanding of the war, transforming it from a simple struggle against a military foe into a confrontation with a profound moral evil. The war in the Pacific was a war of extreme brutality on all sides. It was a war that often erased the line between combatant and civilian, that unleashed new and terrible weapons, that left a legacy of bitterness and trauma that would span generations. But in these small, forgotten encounters, in the jungles of Burma and the islands of the Pacific, something extraordinary happened. The machinery of war, for a brief moment, produced an outcome that was not about death and destruction. It produced a moment of human connection, of cross-cultural collision that was as bewildering as it was profound. The shock experienced by the comfort women was not just about the absence of violence, it was about the presence of an alternative. The American soldiers, simply by behaving according to their own cultural norms, by treating the women with a basic level of decency and respect, were holding up a mirror to the world the women had been forced to inhabit, and in the reflection, they saw not only the horror of their own situation, but also the possibility that another way of being was possible. It was a terrifying, disorienting, and ultimately life-altering revelation. It was the first, faint glimmer of a dawn they had long believed would never come. As the war ended and the long, slow process of repatriation began, the women faced a new set of challenges. Their ordeal was far from over. Many were too ashamed to return to their homes, fearing the stigma that would be attached to them. They were, in the eyes of their own deeply conservative societies, spoiled goods. They carried not only the psychological scars of their trauma, but also the social burden of what had been done to them. Many changed their names, moved to new cities, and tried to bury their pasts, to wrap themselves in a thick blanket of silence. The world, eager to move on from the war, was largely content to let them. The story of the comfort women was an inconvenient truth, a chapter of history that was too ugly, too shameful to be included in the triumphant narrative of victory and rebuilding. The American soldiers who had found them also moved on. They went home, back to their farms and their factories, to their wives and their sweethearts. They tried to pick up the threads of the lives they had left behind, and many of them, too, remained silent. How could they explain what they had seen in that hut? How could they describe the look in those women's eyes to people who had never left America, who could not possibly comprehend the depths of depravity that the war had uncovered? And so, the story was buried, relegated to a few terse lines in classified military archives, a fading memory in the minds of an ever-dwindling number of veterans. For decades, the silence held. The world forgot about the comfort stations. It was as if they had never existed. But history has a way of refusing to stay buried. In the late 1982 and early 1992, the silence was finally broken. One by one, the survivors, now old women, grandmothers with faces etched like ancient maps of suffering, began to speak out. They emerged from the shadows, first in Korea, then in other countries, to demand recognition, an apology, and justice. They held weekly protests. They gave testimony. They wrote memoirs. They forced the world to listen, to confront the history that it had so conveniently forgotten. Their testimony brought the story full circle. It gave names and voices to the silent figures in the gloom that the American soldiers had found so many years before. It filled in the details of the system, its cold-hearted logic, its devastating human cost, and it confirmed, time and time again, that initial, shocking encounter. The survivors spoke of their liberation, of their bewilderment at the kindness of the Allied soldiers. They remembered the chocolate, the cigarettes, the gentle hands of the medics. They remembered the shock of not being touched, the strange and wonderful terror of being treated as human. In the end, the story is not just about the brutality of one army, or the suffering of one group of women. It is a story about the collision of worlds. It is about how the most basic acts of human decency can, in a world that has been stripped of all decency, become the most radical and revolutionary of gestures. The American soldiers in that Burmese jungle did not think of themselves as heroes or revolutionaries. They were just young men, far from home, doing what they thought was right. They were following their own moral compass, a compass that had been forged in a world that, for all its flaws, had not yet succumbed to the total moral nihilism of their enemy. They did not fire a shot. They did not win a strategic victory. But in that dark, rain-soaked hut, they achieved something more profound. By offering a piece of chocolate, by extending a hand not in violence but in aid, they fired a volley against the very ideology they were fighting. They affirmed a fundamental truth that the comfort women system was designed to deny. The truth of a shared and indivisible humanity. For the women who had been trapped in the darkness for so long, that simple, unexpected act of kindness was more than just a gesture. It was a key. Turning in the lock of a prison they had forgotten could be opened. It was the first, shocking, unbelievable proof that the war, and their long nightmare, might one day have an end. And it was a reminder that even in the deepest heart of the jungle, in the midst of the most savage conflict in human history, the smallest light can sometimes be enough to illuminate the path back home.